which will be entitled, or which is entitled, Seeing and Feeling Lessons in Institutional Change, where artists lead, culture follows. I just want to first begin by saying that I'm very thankful to our team here at Spelman College, Rachel Brown, Program Manager of the AUC Art Collective, the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective, Amalade Olubowale, our Program Coordinator, and Fury Reed, who is running the tech behind the scenes and gotten us all together here via Zoom today. My name is Cheryl Finley, and I'm the director of the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. We are the first and only program of its kind in the nation that is designed to train the next generation of African-American art historians and curators and leaders in the museum professions. We're funded by the Alice L. Walton Foundation, and we serve students at Spelman College, Morehouse College, and Clark Atlanta University at the historic Atlanta University Center in the West End in Atlanta. I also wish to acknowledge the chair of the Department of Art and Visual Culture, where our program is based at Spelman College, Myra Green, the division chair of the arts, Ayoka Chinzera, and President Mary Schmidt Campbell, the 10th president of Spelman College, who is leading the charge in the arts at the AUC. We're really, really thankful to all of your support and leadership as we continue to work diligently and tirelessly with our amazing and brilliant students. I'd like to begin with a biography reading of Zoé Whitley's really stellar and amazing career. We had the wonderful pleasure of welcoming her to a virtual Hayward lunch today, where she shared even more about the kind of work that she's done and what has led her to this distinguished career as a curator and director of a gallery and someone who's really helping to create the art history that we're able to teach and share with our students and with our audiences. So just give me 1 second, and I'd like to share with you about Zoé. So Zoé Whitley was born in Washington, D.C., which is actually where I'm from, and also completed a BA in art history with a minor in French at Swarthmore College, just outside of Philadelphia. She also earned a master's degree in history of design from the Royal College of Art in London in 2003, focusing on Black representation in fashion magazines. In fact, Dr. Whitley is very much enamored with fashion, with textiles and the fashion industry, and that's something that's been a highlight and high point of her career. As a curator, she began at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where she worked in the print section as an assistant curator, and that was in the early 2000s. And she's someone who, was describing to us today at lunch the experience of working in that museum, which is a museum that is probably known as being one that holds very interesting and vast collections of decorative arts. But when working in that museum, she also got her start as a curator in the 2007 year, when in the UK, there was a large focus on the anniversary, the 200th anniversary, that is, of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So after her work at the V&A, she moved on to the Tate Gallery, where she had a dual role between 2013 and 2015 as a curator in international art at the Tate Modern, and a curator of contemporary British art at the Tate Britain. So there are two different it's one large institution, the Tate that is, but two different museum spaces in the city of London. In April 2017, her curatorial work centered on the Tate Modern's collection and was focused on international art. And one of the things that she's probably best known for, together with co-curator Mark Godfrey, is the exhibition Soul of a Nation, which opened in 2017 and then traveled around the world, actually, but extensively here in the United States following its debut in London. And it's a really important exhibition that I'm assuming that everyone who's joining us today has probably either seen or might know about. If you haven't picked up the catalog, that's something that I would say to begin with. But as I was sharing with students earlier today at lunch, I think that that's a show that really represented a watershed moment in contemporary art of the Black diaspora, in the way that it exposed so many different audiences to the work of Black artists, especially from the United States in the 20th century. So again, that's a really, really important aspect of thinking about Zoé Whitley's curatorial practice, in the way that, you know, she's very interested in reaching audiences, you know, from different standpoints, from different parts of the world, but audiences to be able to educate them, you know, about the beauty of art, and about the beauty and importance, historical importance of African art, African American art especially. In 2019, she curated the work of Cathy Wilkes for the British Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale. And at the same time in that year, she was appointed senior curator at the Hayward Gallery in London. And just in 2020, she became the director of the Chisenhale Gallery in London, which is where she's currently with us, coming from to us from today. I just wanted to say that, you know, when I think about the way that you've really shaped your career, Zoé, it's really just so exciting for all of us at the AUC Art Collective, for our students, as you saw earlier today at lunch, just to think about the way that you can kind of insert yourself into this unfolding narrative that we're a part of. And I just can't thank you enough for taking the time out to join us and to share your work with us today. And we're really looking forward to learning from you. And so with that, I'm going to turn my mic off and welcome you up to the stage. And thank you all so much again for joining us. And thank you, Zoé.
Thank you so much, Professor Finley, for having me. And I'd also like to thank Rachel Brown and everyone at the AU Consortium, because it is a real privilege to be here. I'd also like to give special thanks to Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, because I think, as will become a recurring theme in this talk, and certainly what I hope is as much of a discursive exchange as possible. So Zoom has its limitations, but there is the Q&A function, and I'm very happy to answer questions. And while we're having to do this remotely, I am very much here and very thrilled to be here. So I think without further ado, we are actually going to make this a conversation in two halves, where I spend the first half with something like an illustrated slide lecture to give, I guess, some flesh to the bones that Professor Finley just suggested over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, highlighting certain projects. And that is because, for me, the lessons in institutional change really begin and end with listening to artists. So we could almost stop the talk there, but there are many examples of how that can play out. And so I will share my screen now, and we will have a few slides. So I hope that everyone is able to see that. So welcome, and thank you for spending your time with me. So I wanted to start with a work that I know from being a museum visitor. It's a work that I find incredibly important, and it is Fred Wilson's Guarded View. So what are on display are 4 headless mannequins wearing different uniforms from what were then, in 1991, the current uniforms of 4 different New York museums and galleries. And you see that the attendant nearby, one of the museum members of staff, is there in his own uniform. And I start with this because Fred Wilson, in the year after making this work, in 1992, created what I think of as a companion work called My Life as a Dog. And it was really an artwork as a disappearing act. So in addition to being an artist, Fred Wilson had extensive experience as a museum guard. So someone who is constantly in the presence of artworks, but is also then able to observe museum and audience behavior. And in the course of what was intended to be an artist performance lecture in the gallery, Fred Wilson was with a number of docents, so effectively museum peers that he was going to provide a tour to. And when they went upstairs to the given floor where he said the tour performance would begin, he had, in the between time, changed into a museum guard uniform. And so all of the docents were standing around waiting for the Fred Wilson they had seen downstairs and completely ignoring the Fred Wilson who was physically there in the room with them because he was wearing a museum guard uniform. And that to me is an important starting point, not only because where conventionally institutions assumed knowledge lies, being with museum directors or curators, and where I've learned throughout my career that knowledge actually lies, which is all around us and in everyone's experience. And certainly I've had some of the richest and most enlightening conversations about artworks from the museum guards who are there with the work every day, who have particular insights and are really worth talking to. So I would certainly encourage everyone to speak to museum guards when they're there in the space. But more than that, thinking about those hierarchies and notions of power, I think there's also something that we absolutely cannot ignore, from the mannequins to the individuals standing here. And that is also the way that race plays out in museums. Who gets seen, who gets heard? And that has been such an important entrenchant question to which I come back again and again. And I think being able to give this talk here tonight at a place like Spelman College, thinking about the importance of the AU Consortium for really encouraging and nurturing the next generation of arts professionals and arts workers and culture leaders is incredibly foundational. But really, so many artists were responsible for what's known in the art world as institutional critique. So really starting to probe and question the accepted behaviors in a museum context. And again, that question I just asked of who gets seen and who gets heard. And so thinking about how Fred Wilson was able to then, in an incredibly indicting way, make sure that individuals understood their complicity in locking us out of these spaces, in refusing to see us within them, is incredibly important. So I would like to move swiftly on because we'll end up getting back to a conversation that we can have with Cheryl and any questions that you might have for me. But as Professor Finley mentioned, possibly the project for which I'm best known is an exhibition that was called Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power. And it opened at Tate Modern in the summer of 2017, and it ran until the autumn of that same year. And is an exhibition that received a lot of positive attention. This is a wall outside of Tate Modern, a former turbine hall, so a big industrial building in central London. And what happened is, over time, more and more individuals began to see the exhibition. It's changed the shape of not only Tate Modern's audience, but also of what felt possible within the context of a large museum that had, I suppose, quite a standard formula for exhibitions about Picasso or Warhol, to really understand that it was possible to expand the canon, not only in the collections that are held in storage or that are shown in galleries, but also through special exhibitions as well. And so I'm very interested to hear that Alice Walton is one of the major supporters of this AU consortium, because it was Alice Walton's support that was really the first breach in what felt like a wall or a barrier in the exhibition being able to tour to the United States. So the first venue that it went to in the United States was in fact the Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, so the home of the Walton family and the Walton family collection. So I will start with this work by David Hammons. It's called Black First, America Second, and it's a work from 1970, and it is what David Hammons really innovated as a form of printmaking, and it's called a body print. So by covering his body in Vaseline and pigment, the way that the various materials are absorbed by the paper surface, you end up with this that looks almost like an X-ray. And it's interesting in this, what is in fact a double self-portrait of the artist, that in the one hand, it looks like he's being almost cleaved in two by this American flag and very much in pain. And in the other is kind of hugging it to him. And in the introduction to the Soul of a Nation catalog, which was mentioned in the introduction, we juxtaposed this work by David Hammons with the work you see here in the foreground by a sculptor named Martin Puryear. And this work is called Self. So by a certain argument, we have two different self-portraits, one a literal self-portrait, and then this work that is actually hollow, but made of wood in this beautiful dark color that is actually quite unknowable and imperceptible. And you have to walk around it to get the full measure of its shape, because it has a beautiful symmetry, but it isn't quite the same from all directions. So this sense of the expression of one's emotions outwardly and the holding of something in. And it also was an important way for us to distill a very important notion that recurs throughout the exhibition, that artists are really using their own modes of expression to tell something about themselves, and that there's no single route for that to happen for a Black artist. And that felt so important to really unpick the notion of Black art as something that could be contained and, you know, described in 140 characters. The fact that artists gave no single answer, the fact that there could be as many answers to the question of what is Black art as there are artists, I think was an important development. And this was because we were really being led by and listening to the artists in the course of putting the exhibition together. So in this one image, there are 4 different works. So you might be able to see my cursor here, but along this wall, made out of barbed wire and chain link, is a sculpture by the sculptor Melvin Edwards. And this was called Curtain for William and Peter. And the William and the Peter of the titles are 2 different artists who are also friends of the artist. So what became quite clear was that the artists are speaking to one another, that they're engaging with one another, thinking through how their materials might play out. And for someone like Melvin Edwards, that was very much about how to explore these materials, this chain link, and to think about both its history in relation to chain gangs or incarceration, but equally to take it to an incredibly poetic place and to think about the interlocking forms of a chain link, the way they interconnect, or the way that barbed wire creates this jagged and broken line, and that you end up with a cast shadow on the wall that ends up itself becoming part of the work. On this far wall on the back, this draped painting is very monumental by Sam Gilliam, another artist from Washington, D.C., was really an experiment in what possibilities might lie in taking the canvas off the stretcher, in thinking about painting as something that can exist sculpturally. And then on this wall, we have a painting called Texas Louise by the artist Frank Bowling. And this is one of his map paintings. So he's stenciling on the canvas, but then equally began working off of the easel and allowing the paint to pool and make different shapes as it dried and congregated, coalesced and congealed on the floor of his studio space. So there are all of these different approaches that together start to create a conversation within the space. And that becomes an important way of thinking through how works can be spatialized. So it's one thing for me to take you through the room and through the exhibition, but actually by standing in that room between those four artworks, there's absolutely a sense that you'll understand that each of the artists has a particular outlook, a particular view, and that that's what they're bringing to bear in their practice. In the room just before that one, we were also able to focus on figurative painting, which is actually something that hadn't necessarily gotten a lot of attention in a place like Tate Modern, where the direction of emphasis was very much on conceptual art, post-minimalist art, on a certain trajectory that almost put to one side or discounted the fact that, you know, there was still a very lively and important tradition of innovating with the figure. So within this one room, as you can see, there is a work by Andy Warhol of Muhammad Ali. And this is Muhammad Ali rendered in red, black, and green. So the colors of the Pan-African flag. And it felt very important in this context to be thinking about post-war American art, and that actually one of the few figures who was arguably even more famous than Warhol himself would have been Muhammad Ali. And to juxtapose him on this same wall with a very different type of painting, much more expressionistic, by Raymond Saunders of the boxer Jack Johnson, created a rhythm in this room that allowed us to look at a range of Black heroes. And the lead image in the exhibition, this image of Barclay L. Hendrix, the painter, another self-portrait wearing the Superman t-shirt. So this time, the artist himself as hero became an important notion for us to be able to explore and to really provide in every context and in every room of the gallery, room after room, and there were 12 of them, to really think about the possibilities of how we could look at the heroism of a Black painter, the innovation of a Black painter. This work in particular, what may look like a gray background is actually done in aluminum leaf, but Barclay Hendrix over a number of years carefully studied the gold leaf tradition that he'd first seen on Byzantine icons when he was traveling around Europe on a painting scholarship. So this sense again of a Black artist painting himself into art history, into the canon, was incredibly powerful and became the cover of the UK edition of the book. And here's a picture. So it's a picture of me in the picture, but this is another work of Barclay Hendrix, where what becomes so interesting is how he's able to paint a group of figures, both men and women, because there's both a nude woman here, but also this central figure who's really in charge of the whole scene, is also a woman wearing a suit, kind of flanked by these three male figures. And what he particularly innovated that really added to luminosity of skin was juxtaposing fast drying acrylic paint with slow drying oil paint. And that's what really starts to make the images come alive and to feel as if the figures could just step out of the frame. And that, again, as a form of thinking about what's possible in institutional change, is also so much about what artists are doing, how they're working, even without institutional attention, even if there isn't an exhibition coming up. Through so much of the research, there was really a painstaking sense of wanting to be incredibly respectful of the artists and of their oeuvre, but in nearly every instance, this was the first time that the work was shown in Tate Modern or in a European context in many instances. So that felt like an important an introduction, but equally one that was made so much based on the scholarship of so many peers, Mary Schmidt Campbell among them, but so many others as well. You know, I think of so many art historians who have made it possible for this work to exist. This is people including David Driscoll and so many others. And that was an important aspect of the research as well, to ensure that we were finding a means of giving credit where that was possible. here is an image of the artist Frank Bowling. So Frank Bowling studied in the United Kingdom and ended up relocating to New York in the 1960s, because despite winning the silver medal in painting at the Royal College of Art to David Hockney's gold, he was told by a number of art establishment gatekeepers that Britain wasn't ready for a talented painter of color. And he ended up being both not only an incredibly important artist, but also an important art critic, writing about a number of his peers like Melvin Edwards and like Jack Whitten. And so here he is reunited with his painting Middle Passage, which is in the Menil collection in Houston. But this was the first time in 2017 that the work was shown. It's since been shown at the Menil, but at the time that we had requested the painting, it had only been in storage. But in this one painting, they're both map stencils of the country of Guyana, also a repeat pattern of Frank Bowling's own mother, as well as images of one of Frank Bowling's sons. And so again, this incredibly layered journey that combines both abstraction and figuration in one work. And another question that recurred throughout the exhibition was which route individual artists were taking relative to their position on the role of abstraction for a Black artist, or what it meant to be dedicated to the figure. This is a children's book that I produced with Tate and illustrated by Helene Baum, called Meet the Artist, Frank Bowling. And it includes a number of Frank's signature kind of pouring and dripping and draping and rolling techniques, so that the possibility of paint can be explored by children. And I think that to me has felt like a very important way of understanding that there are actually so many things that can be unlocked within curatorial practice, that exhibition making isn't the only way to convey a point, in the same way that an artist like Fred Wilson, where I open this talk, might be making installations, but could equally be working in performance that help to push and question our behaviors. I think there are a number of different ways of thinking about where are the distances between how we come to understand the role and the rules of abstraction, but actually just in the making and the doing of it. I think there's something incredibly freeing. And having had the benefit and the privilege of being in Frank's studio and seeing how intuitively children seem to understand that and want to engage in the very ways of thinking about how one might experiment, and something doesn't have to necessarily look like the work that's come before, is an incredibly eye-opening thing, and actually teaches me something about abstraction and relationships to color. This is not a video that I'll show, but just a still, and it relates to something that I was talking with the young students about today, and that is that when working on a project, certainly when I started as a curator, there was a real sense of starting from a place of this exhibition is for everybody, without necessarily asking the question who you were trying to reach and who it was for. And so one of the starting points with Soul of a Nation, and here is a group of fourth graders, or the equivalent of American fourth graders, in front of two photostat collages by Romary Bearden. And it was interesting in speaking to them about what they saw in the work, how Bearden himself came to collage was actually part of wanting to answer this question of what did it mean to be a Negro artist at this particular moment in history. And this was right after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And the artists with whom Bearden was considering this question each had different answers. So an artist like Reginald Gammon felt that it should be figuration and documenting what was actually happening. For an artist like Norman Lewis, it was a far more abstract approach. And Bearden had proposed something far more collaborative, saying, well, collage might be a mode and a register in which we could all try to answer this question together. And the other artists with whom he was discussing were interested in pursuing that kind of collaborative or collective way of making. And the rest is history. Bearden is really the preeminent collagist of the 20th century. I can't think of another. But then again, as a way of experimenting with what might be possible in terms of taking our images from a range of the specifically African-American press, but also things like the Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine, and taking the stuff of our everyday lives and building these kind of beautiful scenes of life, both inside the house and then on the street, became such a very powerful way of saying that other modes of expression were possible. I'm moving back in time now to the first exhibition I ever curated, which Dr. Finlay mentioned, was a project called Uncomfortable Truths at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2007. And so what resulted were a series of interventions. So this wasn't a conventional exhibition. This was a series of artworks that were placed in and around the gallery. So this image here is in the John Madejski courtyard. So right in the center of the museum, there's a large fountain. And so this work by Romuald Hazume, an artist from Benin, is called Den Aida Huedo, Arc-en-Ciel, or rainbow. And it's the symbol of perpetuity or of infinity, the serpent or Ouroboros swallowing its tail. The scales of this serpent are made out of plastic jerry cans, so a very ubiquitous object across West Africa, used to carry water, but also to carry petrol. And what Hazume was particularly commenting on was the modern day slave trade. So really thinking about oil as being something that tethered so many people to an underclass and things for which they would risk their lives, carrying, this kind of highly flammable, potentially explosive material over any number of lines as a means of survival. And each of these scales, you can see the spout of these plastic jerry cans, the handle, which in this case functions almost like a nose, and the kind of molded bridge at the top of the canister being like the bridge of eyebrow line. And so each of these interlocking scales is in fact representing a face, and many of Hazume's other works really reference through this found material of the plastic jerry can a whole history of West African mask making. And so this work was first shown at the Victoria and Albert Museum and is now part of the permanent collection at the Smithsonian Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. The occasion of the bicentenary of the transatlantic slave trade made it possible for a number of new works to be commissioned and created. Another work that I was able to commission for this same project was an intervention that was placed in the Victoria and Albert Museum's Norfolk House Music Room. So there are a number of period rooms in the Victoria and Albert Museum. This one has incredibly opulent surrounds. You can see the kind of gilt work on these mirrors. And what was interesting for Yinka Shonibare, the artist began doing research into a number of different pastimes and really asking the question about how the work of some made possible the leisure of others. And in this case, Sir Foster Cunliffe being the individual who popularized archery in the UK, whose family had made its wealth in the transatlantic slave trade. So something that we might think as far removed from the slave trade as archery, in fact, having an indelible connection to it. So this work was placed in that room. And this is a detail of only 3 figures from what is a larger project of 100 figures by the artist Lubaina Hamid, the first Black woman in the United Kingdom to win the Turner Prize, so the UK's most prestigious contemporary art prize. And each of these figures, so the naming of the money is to ensure that each of these enslaved figures is given a name and a voice. So on the back of each of these painted figures is effectively a small poem saying what the individual's name is, what they are called, and really what motivates them deeply. So here we have two drummers and a map maker, but there were also herbalists and a number of other kinds of figures that really started to kind of animate the inner life and allow for what our understanding is of so many figures of Black ancestry in particular, being in, say, history paintings on the sidelines or there to really amplify the wealth and prestige of the main sitter, for them to really be able to step out of that canvas and then to have a life and an autonomy of their own. And this, again, became such an important part of my learning in terms of thinking about how contemporary artists are looking back at history, how they're understanding how art functions within a museum context and what we can do to help push that context further, or how these things can be, trapped and not allowed the freedom of movement that they need. So I think there are many ways to show this work, but certainly when individuals are allowed to move within and between them, the work is that much more powerful, and that's how the artist intended it. I will now move on to a project that I was fortunate enough to co-curate with a friend, Naima Keith, who's now the vice president of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. This was a group exhibition that took place at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2013, and it was called The Shadows Took Shape. So it was an international exhibition about Afrofuturism. And on the back wall, there are photographs by a Spanish artist named Cristina de Midel. This work, that's the kind of large head from The Wiz by Derek Adams. Lily Reynaud-Dewar did a wonderful text-based piece about her mother's recollections of having spent time with Sun Ra. There's a work by Trenton Doyle Hancock, a British artist named Harold Offey, William Villalongo here, and a quilt that contained a QR code by Sanford Biggers, among a number of other works. And I think that within this context, it's always been incredibly affirming to think about the roles that culturally specific institutions have had in our lives and in our culture. So a museum like the Studio Museum in Harlem was founded in 1968 and was founded very much not only by artists, but with artists in mind. And so very important programs continue there to this day, like their Artist in Residence program. So the studio of the title is very much an active part of the way the museum functions. And it means that the way that work is shown there, the way that artists are able to really use the Studio Museum as an incubator to, say, have a first major show is a really important part of how that work and those artists then go on to exhibit in many other places. Cheryl mentioned that in 2019, I was the curator of the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and the biennial in Venice is the oldest, longest running contemporary art expo. So within a garden in Venice are a series of physical pavilions that are there year round, and they allow for national representation. There's since been a number of projects that help complicate our notions of how a nation is represented. But there is, I can say, certainly a lot of excitement for Venice that will open in just a month's time, because for the first time ever, the United States Pavilion is being represented by an African-American woman, Simone Lee. The British Pavilion is being represented by a Black woman, Sonia Boyce, And also the Scottish Pavilion is being represented by a Black woman, Alberta Whittle. So it's a very exciting opportunity for everyone to, I think about that notion of national representation through fresh eyes. But here's just one view inside the pavilion. So I worked with an artist named Cathy Wilkes. She's an artist from Northern Ireland who grew up in Belfast during the time of the Troubles. She works in a very particular way. You see there are two paintings on this back wall, and then also sculptures in the foreground. The way that she composes the sculptures in 3D space is very much someone who thinks like a painter, who thinks very much about how the relationship between this pale lemony yellow would contrast with this kind of deeper mustard yellow. And she stitched the clothes for these figures in the basement of the pavilion. So the kind of the floor below us. And the paintings have an incredibly painstaking process that is much more akin to sculpture because of how manually laborious it is. She mixes the pigments by hand. She then washes the linen and takes away so much of the layers and then builds those back up. And the tones that you have here are seen so specifically because the light is only natural Venetian daylight. So all of the kind of lighting rigs were taken out of the gallery. So if it was a dark and overcast day, then you would have that same kind of specter of gloom in the gallery. And if it was an incredibly sunny day where the Venetian light is just pouring through the windows, then the whole space would just really kind of radiate in this light. And so it was a very special process working with Cathy Wilkes and thinking through the notion of how much can one hold something back. And so for Cathy Wilkes, what matters so much to her is that people are able to bring themselves to the work and not have, say, a very long text obstructing what they might think of it, whether or not they like the work, whether or not they understand it, that you spend more time looking at the work than reading about the work. So I think this is a very poetic image because it gives you the sense of really being on the same plane and at the same level as the figures. And that was something that was incredibly important to her. So again, always, I think I've always been learning from artists how to think through how space might function, what might work, or what questions it might be okay to leave unanswered. This is an interesting project for me. This was a project that I co-curated with Nancy Ierson, the chief curator and deputy director at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, Elijah Pierce's America. This happened in 2020, so I was actually not able to see the exhibition, though the catalog exists. And Nancy and I were curators together at Tate, whereas Nancy focused on 19th century artists and then me on living artists. That meant that from the point of view of our expertise and projects, we were never really working on any one same subject. But Elijah Pierce, whose father was born enslaved, really allowed us to explore the life and work of someone who experienced pretty much the whole of the 20th century and really represented the overlap between our two areas of study and of focus. And as a self-taught artist, making incredibly powerful and very distinctive wood carvings. It was a wonderful project to be able to show at the Barnes Foundation and for people to learn more about an artist that they may well not have come across just by nature of the fact that he was self-taught rather than someone who came through the various art schools and academies. And again, that in terms of constantly questioning whose work we get to see and perhaps whose we don't is something that I think certainly the next generation of curators will be able to keep pushing and bringing more and more names to the fore. This image is taken from within Chisenhale Gallery. This is an exhibition by Rindon Johnson, an African-American artist who has been based in Berlin and is about to relocate back to the United States. And what we were able to show is a computer rendering of the Atlantic Ocean, and this particular spot in the Atlantic Ocean, known as the Atlantic Cold Blob, is this resolutely cold patch that is affected by both the ice caps melting, but equally the rising water temperatures around it because of climate change. But you end up on a given day of seeing what the weather would have looked like in this space in the previous year. And it was an incredibly mesmerizing project to show. So it was just the ocean in the middle of the floor. So sometimes you would be looking down upon the ocean from a bird's eye view, and then sometimes you would have this view here of the horizon line. And depending on the time of day, it would either be bright sky, or it would be raining or snowing, or it would be nighttime and you would see the moon rising. And then we have this project by Rachel Jones, a young Black British painter, whose this painting that we're looking at right now is currently on view in the gallery. And because at Chisenhale, we're a nonprofit and we only produce new works of art. So this painting that we're looking at right here was only made a few weeks ago. And so there's 7 works in the gallery, most of them large scale works, but equally, as you can see from this one that almost looks like a postage stamp in relation to this larger one, these smaller works as well. So they're really a whole range of projects. But what I was so interested in being able to have this time was not to give a conventional lecture or address, but to start with a range of projects. I'm going to stop my share so that we can see one another. And then just to see where the questions might take us, and equally to have a conversation with Professor Finley, so that for the purposes of the consortium and where your thinking is, I want to be a part of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zoe, for sharing your work with us, and also just opening up some really important questions, I think, for all of us in terms of thinking about the moment in which we are all living. For those of us who've kind of been in this field for a little bit longer, thinking about the historical trajectory. In looking at those slides and thinking about actually the last time I saw you like in person actually was in London, traveling with students from our program with Dr. Andrea Barnwell Brownlee, former director of the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art. We had just traveled with a group of alums from Spelman and President Campbell to Les Modèles Noirs in Paris, the very important exhibition that Dr. Denise Morel curated as part of her PhD thesis at Columbia. But you so graciously welcomed us to I think it was like an exhibition, but also a back room at the Hayward. I remember. And just the kind of impact that, that experience had on our students to be able to not just meet you and think of you as a potential mentor, but also to understand your own trajectory in the field of curatorial practice, in the field of museums, was something that I was really, really moved by. And as you know, we still continue to try to expose our students to these experiences. I wanted to kind of start out with a couple of thoughts, and one is to say that I remember I reviewed Sullivanation for Art Forum, and just to kind of think about the way that exhibitions like Soul of a Nation have such an impact on generations of scholars and artists, and also the way that we, you know, have the ability to work alongside one another and to support one another through opportunities like that, to review shows, just teaching our students in the program that, you know, yes, one can be an art historian or a curator or a conservator, but also a critic and, you know, an ally to, you know, curators that are you know, making a way in the world and making a way for African American art. So I wanted to, you know, begin with a couple questions about Soul of a Nation, just because it has had such an important impact. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, how did it change? Okay, this is a multi-part question. They often are. How did it change you as a curator?
Mm-hmm.
And then how did it change also the Tate? You know, and when I think about, you know, the Tate and having done dissertation research in the UK in the late 1990s, you know, a very, very long time ago, at a time when Turbine Hall wasn't Turbine. I mean, Turbine Hall was Turbine Hall, but Turbine Hall was not the Tate Modern, right? And you know, but it's important to kind of think about, you know, this idea of, you know, institutional change and how exhibitions, curators, and artists can really you know, change institutions and have institutions think about themselves differently, invite in different audiences, or imagine different ways of you know, how they can interact with their communities. So I just thought I would maybe start with those two questions that are kind of related.
Yeah, thank you for both questions. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Denise Morel. I can think of so many others. Certainly Dr. Kelly Jones, Nicole Fleetwood's project, Marking Time more recently. I think that there's so much work out there, and, you know, others have been distinguished fellows here as well, you know, thinking of Bridget Cooks and lots of other people. I think it's interesting that you mentioned Denise Morel, because she actually had a kind of a parallel journey with her project to Soul of a Nations, because for a project that has utterly changed, you know, the Musée d'Orsay and what we think of about so many key works of French painting, literally naming figures who hadn't been named, really kind of literally rewriting art history. I'm in awe of that. Hers, my understanding, was also a project that wasn't necessarily getting a lot of traction until Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation stepped in and started to advocate on her behalf. And certainly that's what happened with our exhibition as well. And that helped people to come and to pay attention to it. So I think that advocacy and that mutual support, or that sense of, you know, what Thelma Golden calls like recognizing your own power and then using that to support other people is so important. And so I know that certainly none of the work that we could have done without Deborah Willis's scholarship, without Kelly Jones's scholarship, that what felt like new to so many people wasn't new. Or even to your point about being a critic, you know, the fact that we are going back and reading the criticism that Frank Bowling wrote in the 1960s and 70s, when many Black artists weren't being reviewed by, you know, the Hilton Kramers or the whomevers at the New York Times and in outlets like Art Forum. So what it meant to actually be providing that rigor and that critical friendship, or, you know, even if it's fighting words, you know, someone who's looking and wanting to engage with the work and push it and make it stronger. And I'm saying all of that because actually that relates to what really stays with me from Soul of a Nation, and that's the people, that's the artists. I mean, there was such an intense period of travel and research across the country, in the US, in 2016 especially, but maybe also at the end of 2015. Now I can't quite remember, but also that first part of 2017. And so what really stayed with me is the relationships with the artists, that I'm still in touch with, the artists and their families. That's really changed my life in the best possible way. And even my family members, there's certain people that when if I talk to Ming Smith, the first thing she asks is, how's your mom doing? And there's that wonderful connection. Or the Dekarava family always wants to know how my daughter's doing. And that sense of artists being people. I mean, people who absolutely make our world so much better. But equally that they are people who, what to get them when you go to Panera. There's that human connection, I think, brought an entirely different level and understanding to the project. And I suppose it created a very great sense of respect and responsibility for what the project needed to do, even at a time when there was zero indication that it would have an afterlife beyond Tate Modern. It was really about doing justice to the artists and their work and their positions, and being honest and transparent about their disagreements, since that was part of the story, to really tell a complex and nuanced story that presented people as people who, completely disagreed fundamentally with someone else who might otherwise be written about them in the same breath for whatever reason. To be able to flesh that out spatially and to give space for that is something that was really incredibly important. And then I think institutionally, again, I would say, I know what it changed for me. As I was telling your students today, it was incredibly important for me to understand the specificity of place, having started curating in the early 2000s at a time when, with the best intentions, but without actually doing any probing or interrogating, the standard line was, the exhibition's for everybody, the museum's for everybody. But there was no attempt to understand who is everybody. Everybody's not in this building. So why isn't everybody in this building? What does everybody mean? And what else do we need to do to make a welcome, to think about programming, to think about our language, any number of things, to think about where we advertise, what it is we're doing. And so the biggest change for me was seeing the audience in the museum look so much more like the audience outside the museum, looked so much more like London. And so what I'd specifically said, and I definitely had my own kid in mind, even though she was a bit younger then, but it was very much thinking about an intention as specific as, if we were to just box pop young people on the street and ask them to name a Black artist, can they name one, A? And B, can they name one other than Jean-Michel Basquiat? I love Basquiat, so this is it's not against Basquiat, it's an additive thing. Yeah. And that to me felt so important, particularly in a city when 1 in 4 young people has at least one non-white parent, or one parent from the global majority. That's major. That says something about our city, but we weren't reflective of that population, despite at that point being maybe the most visited museum on the planet, or certainly one of 2. I think about 7 million visitors a year. And certainly that doesn't mean it's ticketed people, but that kind of question, and trying to do something about it intentionally, and not saying, oh, because we're Tate, they'll definitely come. Saying, right, well, actually, what else might we do to make people feel that they're welcome here, or that there's something here that they might be interested in. that was the big question that shifted for me.
So then I guess maybe a follow-up question would be then, so then what did Tate do? Like, one of the things that I love about your show is that, yes, it had art. Yes, it had art by amazing, Black artists who, many of whom grew up around each other, some of whom disagreed with one another. Black artists who had work that, as you said, never had been shown before, or hadn't seen the light of day in, decades. And that's another probably question or conversation that we could get into that's highly problematic. But I think the other thing that I loved about your show is that it had a life at the Tate, on the walls, in the rooms, but it also had a life online. It had a life that, that encouraged us to think about music, encouraged us to think about documentary photography and other things that characterized, this period that you focused upon, this what is it, 20-40 year period that you focused upon in Soul of a Nation. And so I just wanted to know, from your perspective, in addition to access, right, opening up the Tate to other audiences, making other audiences that had not really been considered feel perhaps that the Tate might be a place for them too. How else did it change, or what lessons do you think did the institution learn from the experience of your exhibition? And maybe the other part of that same question could be, did it, or how did it also change the way other major art institutions in London thought about the kinds of shows that they might actually consider having in their institutions?
I think the changes were many, and they were all very intentional. I think a lot of them happened in a more curatorially hands-on way than might have otherwise. There was a lot of questioning of, say, where it's the big exhibitions that get like the tube campaign. So to be on the subway, but also who rides the subway? The tube costs more than the bus. So actually, by having some of our posters in different postcodes, so the equivalent of zip codes than would normally, it meant that the poster got seen in different parts of London. It was the first time that posters for a Tate exhibition were in my own neighborhood. I didn't specifically put my own postcode in the mix, but that was part of it. That was a very intentional change, and it did create awareness in a different way. Again, and I'm going to keep singing his praises, but again, Darren Walker, but also Elizabeth Alexander, who at the time was at the Ford Foundation, supported our work, so that, again, not taking for granted the sense that, oh, well, people will definitely come and see the show, which maybe would have otherwise been the operative mode. It was much more thinking, actually, even if young people never set foot in here, what if they end up coming across a YouTube video by a young British filmmaker that they respect, that then introduces them to an artist that they would want to find out more about. So it also meant working in a slightly different way and being a little bit less secretive or proprietary about our checklist. So speaking with young filmmakers about the artists who were in the show and saying, are there any of these artists who are interesting to you? Because we can make it possible through the Ford Foundation to then allow you to make a film about this artist. So Cecilia Meke, who'd had a very popular YouTube series called Strolling, made a film about Faith Ringgold. Khalil Joseph, so the only filmmaker who was not Black British, obviously incredibly well known for Lemonade, but also Black News and lots of other really stunning projects, made a film inspired by Roy Decarava's use of the color black and the particular way that he was able to really kind of coax a certain darkness in the dark room. And those films then went out in the world in a particular way, but actually did translate to people then having their curiosity piqued and then coming to the museum. We also just did a lot of things based on what we saw. So there would be young people in the museum. We were in the gallery just every single day. And if young people were on their kind of usual high school tour of the free galleries, they'd be like, wow, I really want to go in there, but I don't have any money. Then we would walk them in. So that happened a lot. And then there also started to be something I had never really experienced before in a museum. I had seen it at the V&A happen with the fashion exhibitions, where then like celebrities come, it's quite a big deal, but I was never part of that. But we started getting quite a lot of interest in musicians and actors coming. And then, so that also then, of course, like massively helps with social media and people being able to see the work because, Will Smith or Jay-Z or whomever posts about it, and that we could have never even imagined.
So I wanted to ask another question that was inspired by what you were just saying, but also thinking about your own practice as a curator and experiences that you've had, on the global stage. So your work on your Venice Biennale exhibition for the British Pavilion. I think the question is more about kind of like the process. So we have a course running at Spelman College that's looking very specifically at the career of Simone Lee. And we'll be bringing students to the Biennale Loophole Retreat Conference in the fall. Mm-hmm. And so we've been looking closely this spring semester at, not just Lee's work, but also this long history of the Venice Biennale, and how, as we know, this is seemingly a banner year, but we could have said the same thing in 2015 when Okwuem Wazer was the artistic director of the entire Biennale. And so I wanted to know more about your experience on that project and sort of, from, again, the process side, the selection side, because we've been speaking with students in class about, this is how it happens in the United States. We know that there's a committee. We understand that proposals are submitted, but it's different in every country. We also know that there are always so few and not enough artists who are coming from the continent, from individual countries themselves, in terms of having pavilion representation, or even being part of some of the larger exhibitions that might be curated, say, by the artistic director herself. And so I thought I would ask you about your experience, because we've been really trying to think about ways and propose ways that there could be greater representation of artists of color on this world stage, and wanted to know about the kinds of choices that you made for your British Pavilion exhibition, and what the process was in terms of your selection and the feedback over time.
Yeah, so thanks for that. So yes, incredibly different process from what happens in the USA, and really different from any process that happens anywhere else. So just so I'm not assuming knowledge on the call, broadly, in the US, what happens is the artist and a curator associated with an institution, like a major kind of nonprofit making institution rather than a commercial gallery, put forward their proposal, and then that's actually considered by the State Department. So it is very much a kind of international diplomatic exercise, what happens representing your nation at Venice. At Britain, it is handled by the British Council. So again, a kind of from a cultural diplomacy side. And basically before my year, before I was appointed, I think that would have been at the end of 2017, it had always been internal, that the curator of the British Pavilion was an employee of the British Council. And there's an annual panel convened that is confidential until the point of announcing the artist, of curators and various senior arts workers from across the UK who meet to discuss who will be nominated to represent Britain. And that is the official pavilion. But then there are also pavilions for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Those sit outside of the normal collateral, the normal pavilions that are, say, conventionally in the running for something like the Golden Lion, the prizes that are given out at Venice. So an open call was issued, and so I applied for it like a job. So yeah, so that was that, and Cathy was selected. I was able to observe, so I was in the room when the selection was made. But again, that same A group that changes biannually selects the artist. So we were kind of brought together in a very particular way. The same thing has happened for Sonia Boyce and the curator of the British Pavilion this year, but this time they inverted the process. So the panel convened and selected the artist first, and then the artist sat in on the interviews for the curator.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting process.
Yeah, it's a real, I think the whole notion is like to avoid a kind of, I think what works in some circumstances, I think in the British context, I think was always meant to avoid a kind of cronyism, or a sense that like, oh, well, of course they got it because they know so and so and so and so, by having these two, these two parallel processes and then kind of bringing the two together. I'm just aware of time, and we've got a few.
We have some questions. Yes. So I'm going to pose them actually in different order.
Okay.
I have my eye on them, but
okay.
And I just wanted to say to everyone, if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A, and we will get to them in the remaining 12 and so minutes. But the first question comes from Vicky, who asks, what is your impression as to whether recognition of and inclusion of Black artists in exhibitions, particularly in Europe and the United States, will continue?
I think it depends. I certainly think it will. I've seen a real change in programming in terms of the diversity of artists represented. So whereas in the last decade, there was a real emphasis on gender equity, but what that meant primarily was white women artists getting shows, to speak bluntly. I think that there is now a much greater visibility. I would say that comes with certain, I'm using Jada Pinkett's word in a different context, entanglements, because I certainly think from a commercial point of view, there's a real, it's funny for me to look back at the slides of the figuration room at Tate, because that was like a pretty radical thing to do at the time, even just that few years ago, because figuration was not having the moment that it is having now. But I see
my question would be, when is that moment going to stop?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I see a huge amount of of artists from African-American artists, but also artists from across the diaspora, having shows in Belgium in particular. In France, not quite so much, but I mean, I do see it. So yeah, my sense is that it has changed, and it is more visible. And I certainly have noticed it more on when you look at the artist lists for major exhibitions, you know, like the Venice Biennale, or just looking at the national representation, the fact that Britain, Scotland, and the USA are all represented by Black women, I think is something important that I certainly want to see continue, because, you know, being a first is not easy, but it's also, you know, something that should not be an exception. None of us want to kind of revel in that exceptionalism. We want to push things forward, but I do see the changes happening.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, Vicky, but I wonder if your question might also come from you know, experience and lived experience, that, you know, those of us who lived through the 1980s, for example, you know, experienced this, you know, huge boom and interest in, you know, everything Black, you know, Black culture, Black literature, Black music, Black art. And it lasted, you know, for maybe, call it 5, maybe there was a 10-year window for some, and then it went back to business as usual. And so I wonder if that question is kind of hoping that something that is more sustainable in terms of infrastructure, foundation, you know, people in place to be able to support one another, is, you know, is what we might see in the future. There was an ArtNet editorial that some of us were discussing late last week, that looked at some of the advances that have seemingly taken place at US museums with the appointments of curators and directors and people in leadership roles of color, you know, specifically, you know, African American, at US museums in the past 2 to 3 years, and how there, you know, have been so many people who've been appointed, yet there are a lot of people who've also not stayed in these positions after 6 months or, you know, or more. And so this question of, you know, creating an infrastructure that enables, you know, appointments like these that are deserving for sure and overdue, but to be able to actually bear fruit and be in a place to be sustained over time.
And do the work. Yeah, I think from that side, again, there's so much more work that needs to be done. But what I see, I suppose, in terms of my peer group now starting to be in various organizations where we can also make decisions and push certain things forward. You know, the artistic director of Frieze London is a Black woman, and then she and I worked together to establish the Frieze Deutsche Bank Curatorial Fellowship. Sepakyang Yama's artistic director at Innova. There's now a director of, I don't want to get the title wrong, but I think it's curatorial practice and program at the Serpentine, Yosomi Umolu. Again, I think there's starting to be some changes where it isn't just about the kind of odd position, but it's the individuals who are then actually able to influence the program and to shape the future direction of travel for institutions that is starting to change, but that certainly needs to happen more. But I think here also it has to do with a kind of generational change where a number of vacancies are happening simultaneously, where, you know, they've been held by the same person for the last, say, 20 or 25 years. And then in the course of that stepping down, what that may prompt in terms of what that change looks like is kind of remains to be seen, but hopefully there are roles that then can be sustained.
Definitely, definitely. And that generational piece is, I think, an important point as well, in answering the question and sort of to the, solving the problem and the equation to the problem. So we have a question. There are two more, and so I'll read this one first. This is from Chad Dawkins, who is a faculty member with us at the AUC Art Collective.
We'll see you tomorrow, no?
Yes, you're visiting his class tomorrow. That's right. So Chad says, Chisenhale is somewhat known for programming that has been self-critical as an institution embracing forms, I think forms of institutional critique. I am thinking specifically about Maria Eichhorn's closed show a decade ago. Also, isn't it founded by or meant to actively support artists? ? So the question is, how do you approach your work in such an environment? How does it affect your thinking about programming or the program? Is it different than the V&A and the Tate? And you've been at some of the major institutions, in London in particular. The last question is kind of about the work that you're working on now, and I'll get to that once you address Chad's, and just looking at the time.
I'll be quick. So yeah, Maria Eichhorn's project was called 5 weeks, 25 days, 175 hours. And so for the duration of her exhibition between April and May of 2016, the gallery wasn't open, and the individuals who worked at the gallery were not allowed to work. And so, yeah, I think that is a really useful kind of touchstone of how we work. And then equally knowing that in the history of the organization, the fact that it was founded by artists who had been evicted from their Butler's Wharf warehouse because of property developers, and then found a disused warehouse in what was then not fashionable East End, in a former veneer factory and brewery warehouse on what's otherwise a residential street. So really interesting location. So yeah, I think approaching the work in that environment is to really be true to the history of the place. We are completely artist focused and artist led, and we're able to start from a place of how can we make this thing possible rather than no, we can't possibly. So that is really exciting. And I think we really believe in the artists that we work with. So we're trying to figure out how to make those things happen. And because we aren't a venue for hire or even showing works that already existed, that we're following artists closely, working with them for a sustained period of time, usually over a 1 to 2 year period. So what we show in the gallery, like the painting I showed you of Rachel Jones's or Rindon Johnson's work, didn't exist before the conversation started. In Rindon's case, it was a co-commission with Sculpture Centre, so it showed at Sculpture Centre first, but the principle remains. So I think it's really helpful to think about program, because we're constantly thinking, and I'm constantly thinking about what it means to provide that platform, how we can be constructive and provide that critical friendship to an artist, what we can give them and how we can support their work to grow. And that makes programming and inviting the artists quite clear, because our mission is really clear. And then, yeah, we'll try and do the last one in the last.
Yeah. And I also just want to say for our students and everyone, I just love the Chisenhale model. I mean, it's a great model when we think about, the crisis of the existence of museums and museum spaces. So the last question is from Elise Stone, who says, "Hi Zoe, Elise Stone here. My family are Spelman Morehouse alum, currently in the master's program with Harold Offe at RCA. So happy to tune in. My question, I'm curious to hear more about your Black Futurist project. What is your curatorial perspective on Black futurism in the art space, and where do you have excitement around these narratives?"
Yeah, I don't know. I think because Naima and I did that project almost 10 years ago. So that was 2013. I think where I'm excited by it is seeing how other people are kind of coming to Afrofuturism and then putting their own take on it. I mean, it was, I think, incredibly inspiring for us that that project was one of the touchstones for Hannah Beekler's Afrofuturist period rooms at the Met. So we were part of some of the thinking sessions before that happened, and seeing some, like, there's a Philadelphia potter named Roberto Lugo, calls himself the ghetto potter, and the pots are extraordinary. I have 2 mugs and I absolutely love them. So, I mean, I get really excited about that. I think there's so many possibilities for where that work can go. I think for us with that exhibition, Naima and I, oh, Cheryl's sharing some things.
This is one of his works. It's part of our marketing material.
Okay.
Visionaries Welcome. I don't know if I'm trying to get it there.
Yeah, it's the filter is slightly,
Yeah,
it's doing some hologrammy stuff,
weird.
but
Yeah. Anyway.
But yeah, I think for us, what felt interesting at the time was to really look at how global Afrofuturism was, and to have it be part of a dialogue that included, you know, an artist like Lili Renaud-Dewar in France, and how Sun Ra had been an influence on her practice. Certainly looking at Harold's work, and he was part of our crit during Rindon Johnson's project. So Harold is definitely part of our Chisenhale community. And I think it's those sorts of questions that are always interesting to me. I think that there's an aspect of it that can look super great on Instagram, but I'm actually interested in those kind of the emancipatory possibilities of it as a mode of expression or as a literary form. So I think, yeah, all of that is incredibly exciting to me. But yeah, lots more to come, I'm sure.
For sure. Thank you so much, Zoe. Really, really happy to have you here. Thank you for sharing your work, your experience, your expertise and knowledge with our students and with the AUC Art Collective community. And I look forward to the next time, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.